Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now let's dive into the stories. The rain was relentless, hammering against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. The wipers struggled to keep up, their rhythmic squeaking the only sound in the cab besides the low hum of the engine. It was nights like these that made Marcus question why he'd ever become a taxi driver. The city was a ghost town, the streets slick and empty, the neon signs of closed shops reflecting in the puddles like distorted memories. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:47 a.m. The graveyard shift. The shift where the world felt like it belonged to someone else. Marcus had been driving for hours, picking up the occasional drunk or night owl, but now the streets were deserted. He was about to call it a night when the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "Marcus, you still out there? Gotta pick up on 5th and Elm. Last fare of the night." He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "Yeah, I'm here. On my way." The address was a dimly lit corner of the city, near an old industrial area that had been abandoned for years. Marcus pulled up to the curb, the headlights cutting through the rain, and there she was, a woman standing under a flickering street lamp. She was dressed in a long dark coat, her face pale and drawn, her hair plastered to her head by the rain. She didn't move, just stared at the taxi with an intensity that made Marcus uneasy. He rolled down the window. "You called for a cab?" She nodded silently and slid into the back seat. Marcus caught a glimpse of her in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were hollow, her lips pressed into a thin line. She gave him an address on the outskirts of the city, a place he'd never been before. He punched it into the GPS, but the route seemed off, taking them through winding backstreets and alleys he didn't recognize. The silence in the cab was oppressive. Marcus tried to make small talk, but the woman didn't respond. She just stared out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The rain grew heavier, the windshield wipers working overtime, and the streets became narrower, darker. The GPS led them to a desolate road lined with skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the sky. "You sure this is the right address?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with unease. The woman didn't answer. She just pointed ahead, her finger trembling slightly. Marcus swallowed hard and kept driving. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the headlights illuminating nothing but rain and shadows. Finally, they reached a crumbling house at the end of the road, its windows boarded up, the roof sagging under the weight of the storm. Marcus pulled up to the curb and turned to face her. "We're here." The woman didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the house, her breathing shallow. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Ma'am?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned to him then, her eyes wide and pleading. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't make me go back there." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean? This is where you wanted to go, right?" She shook her head violently. No, I didn't. I didn't call for a cab. I didn't ask to come here." Marcus's heart began to race. "Then who did?" Before she could answer, the radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice was distorted, almost unrecognizable. "Marcus, come in. Marcus, are you there?" He grabbed the radio. "Yeah, I'm here." "What's going on?" There was a long pause, then the dispatcher's voice came through again, cold and emotionless. "Marcus, there's no fare at 5th and Elm. There hasn't been anyone there for hours." Marcus's blood ran cold. He turned to look at the woman, but the back seat was empty. She was gone. He whipped his head around, scanning the street, the house, the rain-soaked darkness. There was no sign of her. His hands shook as he grabbed the radio again. "What the hell is going on? I just dropped someone off. She was right here." The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Marcus, you need to leave. Now." He didn't need to be told twice. He threw the car into gear and sped away, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. The house disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the storm. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The rain seemed to whisper, the shadows seemed to move, and the woman's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't make me go back there." The next night, Marcus tried to shake off the memory. It had to have been a mistake, a trick of the light, his tired mind playing games. But as he drove through the empty streets, the rain falling once again, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The radio was silent, the streets eerily quiet. And then as he turned a corner, he saw her, the same woman, standing under a flickering street lamp, her coat soaked, her eyes hollow. She raised her hand, signaling for the cab. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to drive away to pretend he hadn't seen her. But something compelled him to stop. He rolled down the window, his heart pounding. "Where to?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She leaned in, her face inches from his, her eyes filled with a desperate sadness. "You know where." And as the rain poured down, Marcus realized that this was only the beginning. The night was long, and the city had more secrets than he could ever imagine. Secrets that didn't stay buried. Secrets that waited in the shadows, in the rain, in the backseat of his cab. And they weren't going to let him go. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He wanted to drive away, to leave this woman, this thing, behind. But his body wouldn't obey. It was as if some unseen force had taken control, forcing him to open the door for her. She slid into the back seat silently, her coat dripping rainwater onto the floor. The smell of damp earth filled the cab, mingling with the faint metallic tang of blood. "Where to?" he asked again, his voice trembling. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at him through the rearview mirror, her eyes dark and unblinking. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, barely audible over the sound of the rain. "You know where." Marcus's stomach churned. He didn't want to go back to that house. He didn't want to see those boarded-up windows, that sagging roof, that road that seemed to stretch into oblivion. But he couldn't refuse. It was as if her words had wrapped around his mind, pulling him like a puppet on strings. He drove. The GPS flickered on, but the screen was distorted, the map a jumble of nonsensical lines and symbols. Marcus tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the road ahead. The streets grew narrower, the buildings more decrepit, until they were once again on that desolate road lined with skeletal trees. The rain fell harder, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. The house loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the stormy sky. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he pulled up to the curb. He didn't want to stop. He didn't want to let her out. But the car came to a halt on its own, the engine idling softly. The woman didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the house. Marcus turned to look at her, his breath shallow. "Why do you keep coming back here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer at first. Then, slowly, she turned to face him. Her eyes were filled with a sorrow so deep it made Marcus's chest ache. "I can't leave," she said. "Not until it's finished." "What's finished?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out into the rain. Marcus watched as she walked toward the house, her figure fading into the darkness. He wanted to drive away, to leave her behind, but something compelled him to follow. He grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the cab, the rain soaking him instantly. The house was even more ominous up close. The front door hung open, creaking on its hinges. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Marcus hesitated at the threshold, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He didn't want to go inside. But he had to know. He had to understand. The interior of the house was a maze of shadows and broken furniture. The floorboards groaned under his weight, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper. Marcus's flashlight flickered as he moved deeper into the house, the beam catching glimpses of something dark and wet on the walls. Blood. He found her in the living room, standing in front of an old, cracked mirror. She was staring at her reflection, her face twisted in anguish. Marcus approached cautiously, his heart pounding. "What is this place?" he asked. She turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. "This is where it happened. Where he happened." Marcus frowned. "Who?" Before she could answer, a sound echoed through the house, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Marcus spun around, his flashlight darting across the room. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, taking on shapes that made his blood run cold. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "Now." The woman shook her head. "I can't. Not until he's gone." "Who's gone?" Marcus demanded, his fear turning to frustration. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to the mirror. Marcus turned to look, his breath catching in his throat. The reflection wasn't hers. It was a man's face, twisted with rage, his eyes black as coal. Marcus stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, the beam illuminating the walls, the ceiling, the floor, all covered in blood. The growl came again, louder this time, and Marcus felt something brush against his leg. He looked down to see a hand, pale and rotting, reaching out from beneath the floorboards. He screamed, kicking it away, and bolted for the door. The woman's voice echoed behind him, filled with despair. "You can't leave me here." But Marcus didn't stop. He ran through the house, the walls closing in around him, the shadows reaching out to grab him. He burst through the front door and into the rain, slipping and sliding as he made his way back to the cab. He threw himself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. The engine roared to life as he sped away, the house disappearing in the rearview mirror. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The back seat was empty, but the smell of damp earth and blood lingered. And in the rearview mirror, just for a moment, he thought he saw her, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with sorrow. The next night, Marcus didn't go to work. He couldn't. He sat in his apartment, the rain tapping against the windows, and tried to convince himself that it had all been a nightmare. But deep down he knew it wasn't. He knew she was still out there waiting for him. And he knew he couldn't leave her alone. Marcus didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, the woman in the rain, her hollow eyes, her trembling hands. He saw the house, the blood on the walls, the man's face in the mirror. He heard the growl, felt the rotting hand on his leg. By morning he was exhausted, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to go back. He didn't know why. He didn't even know if he believed in ghosts or curses or any of that. But something inside him, something deeper than fear, told him he couldn't leave her there. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the rain began to fall once more, Marcus got into his cab and drove. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't pick up any fares. He just drove, following the same route he had taken the night before. The streets were eerily quiet, the city holding its breath as if it knew what he was about to do. When he reached the desolate road lined with skeletal trees, his hands began to shake. The house loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged and menacing. Marcus pulled up to the curb and turned off the engine. For a long moment he just sat there, staring at the house, his heart pounding in his chest. Then he stepped out of the cab. The rain soaked him instantly, but he barely noticed. He walked toward the house, his flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the darkness. The front door was still open, creaking on its hinges. Marcus hesitated at the threshold, his breath shallow. He didn't want to go inside. But he had to. The interior of the house was just as he remembered, dark, decaying, and filled with the stench of blood. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he moved deeper into the house, the flashlight beam darting across the walls. The blood was still there, dark and dried, but now it seemed to form patterns, symbols he didn't recognize. He found her in the living room, standing in front of the cracked mirror. She was crying, her shoulders shaking, her hands pressed against the glass. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because you asked me to," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. "Because I can't leave you here." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "You can't help me. No one can." "Tell me what happened," Marcus said, stepping closer. "Tell me who he is." She hesitated, then nodded toward the mirror. Marcus turned to look, his breath catching in his throat. The man's face was there again, twisted with rage, his black eyes staring straight at Marcus. But this time Marcus didn't look away. He stared back, his fear giving way to anger. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded. The man's lips curled into a sneer. "I'm her husband," he said, his voice low and guttural. "And she's mine." Marcus turned to the woman. "Is that true?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He killed me. He killed me and he won't let me go." Marcus's heart ached for her. He didn't know how or why, but he believed her. He believed every word. "What do I need to do?" he asked. She reached out and took his hand, her touch cold but firm. "You need to break the mirror." Marcus frowned. "The mirror?" "It's where he's trapped," she said. "Where he's been keeping me. If you break it, he'll be gone." I'll be free. Marcus hesitated. It sounded too simple, too easy. But he didn't have any other ideas. He picked up a piece of broken furniture, a chair leg, and turned to face the mirror. The man's face twisted in fury, his black eyes blazing. "Don't you dare," he roared. Marcus didn't listen. He swung the chair leg with all his strength, shattering the mirror into 1,000 pieces. The sound was deafening, the shards scattering across the floor. For a moment there was silence. Then the house began to shake, the walls cracking, the floorboards splintering. Marcus stumbled back, dropping the chair leg as the man's face appeared in the shards of glass, screaming in rage. "No. No." The woman's hand tightened around Marcus's. "It's working," she whispered. "He's losing his hold." The shaking grew more violent, the air filled with the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. Marcus grabbed the woman's hand and pulled her toward the door, the two of them stumbling through the collapsing house. They burst out into the rain just as the house gave one final shudder and collapsed in on itself, the sound echoing through the night. Marcus and the woman stood there, soaked and breathless, staring at the ruins of the house. The rain began to ease, the storm passing as quickly as it had come. The woman turned to Marcus, her face filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "You set me free." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say. He watched as she began to fade, her figure dissolving into the rain and the night. And then she was gone. The next night Marcus went back to work. The streets were quiet, the rain light and gentle. He didn't see her again. He didn't see the house. But sometimes, when he was alone in the cab, he thought he felt her presence, a cold hand on his shoulder, a whisper in his ear. And he knew she was at peace. As for Marcus, he kept driving. The city was full of secrets, and he had a feeling this wasn't the last strange fare he'd pick up. But for now, the night was quiet and the road was clear. And that was enough. The city was alive with the hum of nightlife, but Marcus felt detached from it all. He'd been driving his taxi for years, and the late shifts had become a routine. The neon lights, the drunk laughter, the occasional argument, it all blurred together. But tonight felt different. The air was heavier, the streets quieter, as if the city itself was holding its breath. It was past midnight when the call came through the dispatcher. A pickup on the edge of the industrial district, near the old train yard. Marcus hesitated. That part of the city was desolate at night, a place where even the streetlights seemed to flicker with unease. But business had been slow and he couldn't afford to turn down a fare. When he arrived, the street was empty except for a single figure standing under a flickering lamp. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat that seemed to swallow his frame. His face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but Marcus could feel his gaze as he pulled up to the curb. "You called for a cab?" Marcus asked, rolling down the window. The man nodded silently and slid into the back seat. He gave an address, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, and then fell quiet. Marcus glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but the man's face remained hidden. There was something unsettling about him, something that made Marcus's skin crawl. The drive was silent except for the sound of the engine and the occasional patter of rain against the windshield. The GPS led them through winding streets, past abandoned factories and crumbling warehouses. The further they went, the more Marcus's unease grew. He tried to make small talk, but the man didn't respond. He just sat there, perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. When they finally reached the warehouse, Marcus pulled up to the curb and turned to face the man. "We're here." The man didn't move. He just sat there, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something Marcus couldn't hear. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out a wad of cash. He handed it to Marcus without a word. Marcus counted the bills, his hands trembling slightly. It was more than enough to cover the fare. "Thanks," he said, forcing a smile. "Have a good night." The man didn't respond. He opened the door and stepped out into the rain, his coat billowing around him like a shadow. Marcus watched as he walked toward the warehouse, his figure fading into the darkness. He waited until the man disappeared inside before driving away. The next night, Marcus was back on the road. The memory of the man in the coat lingered in his mind, but he tried to shake it off. It was just another fare, he told himself. Just another strange night in the city. But then the call came again. The same pickup location. The same address. Marcus's stomach churned as he pulled up to the curb. The man was there again, standing under the flickering lamp, his face hidden by the shadow of his hat. He slid into the back seat without a word and gave the same address. Marcus didn't ask questions. He just drove, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. The silence in the cab was oppressive, the man's presence like a weight pressing down on him. When they reached the warehouse, the man handed him another wad of cash and disappeared into the darkness. Night after night it was the same. The man in the coat. The same pickup. The same destination. Marcus tried to refuse, but something compelled him to keep going. It was as if the man had some kind of hold over him, some unseen force that dragged him back to that desolate street. One night, Marcus decided he couldn't take it anymore. When the man slid into the back seat, Marcus turned to face him. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Why do you keep calling me?" The man didn't answer. He just sat there, his face hidden, his hands resting on his knees. Marcus's frustration boiled over. "Answer me. What do you want?" For a moment there was silence. Then the man spoke, his voice low and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves scraping against stone. "You'll see." Marcus's blood ran cold. He wanted to kick the man out of the cab, to drive away and never look back. But he couldn't. He just drove, his hands shaking, his mind racing. When they reached the warehouse, the man didn't get out immediately. He sat there, his head tilted as if he were listening to something. Then he turned to Marcus, and for the first time Marcus saw his face. It was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. His lips were cracked and dry, his skin stretched tight over his bones. But the worst part was his smile, a twisted, unnatural grin that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "Thank you," the man said, his voice dripping with malice. "You've been very helpful." Before Marcus could respond, the man stepped out of the cab and disappeared into the warehouse. Marcus sat there, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what was happening. But he knew one thing: he couldn't keep doing this. The next night Marcus didn't go to work. He stayed home, the curtains drawn, the lights off. But as the hours passed, he began to feel a strange pull, like an invisible thread tugging at his mind. He tried to resist, but it was no use. He got into his cab and drove to the pickup location. The man was there waiting. Marcus didn't say a word. He just drove, his hands trembling on the wheel. When they reached the warehouse, the man turned to him and smiled that twisted smile. "You're almost there," he said. "Just one more trip." Marcus didn't respond. He just watched as the man disappeared into the warehouse. And then he made a decision. He wasn't going to let this happen again. He wasn't going to be a pawn in whatever game this man was playing. He got out of the cab and followed the man inside. The warehouse was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of rust and decay. Marcus moved cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he had to find it. Then he saw it, a door at the far end of the warehouse, slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. The room was filled with mirrors, dozens of them, arranged in a circle. In the center of the circle was the man, his coat discarded, his gaunt body exposed. He was chanting something, his voice low and guttural, his eyes fixed on the mirrors. Marcus didn't understand what he was seeing, but he knew it was wrong. He stepped forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "What are you doing?" he demanded. The man turned to him, his smile widening. "I'm setting them free," he said. "And you're going to help me." Before Marcus could react, the man lunged at him, his hands clawing at Marcus's face. Marcus stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, the room plunging into darkness. He could hear the man's laughter, feel his cold breath on his skin. And then, suddenly, the mirrors began to shatter. Marcus woke up in his cab, the engine idling, the rain tapping against the windshield. He didn't know how he'd gotten there. He didn't know what had happened. But he knew one thing: he wasn't alone. In the back seat, the man in the coat sat silently, his face hidden by the shadow of his hat. "Let's go," the man said, his voice low and raspy. "We're not done yet." Marcus's hands tightened on the wheel. He didn't know what was happening. He didn't know what the man wanted. But he knew one thing: he couldn't stop now. The night was long and the city was full of secrets. And Marcus was just beginning to uncover them. Marcus's hands trembled on the steering wheel as he drove through the rain-soaked streets. The man in the coat sat silently in the back seat, his presence like a suffocating weight. Marcus didn't know where they were going. The man hadn't given an address this time. He just said, "Drive." The city blurred outside the windows, the neon lights smearing into streaks of color. Marcus's mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened in the warehouse. The mirrors, the chanting, the man's twisted smile, it all felt like a nightmare, but he knew it was real. And now he was trapped in it. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. He just sat there, his face hidden in shadow, his hands resting on his knees. Marcus glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his stomach churning. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't let this man control him. "What do you want from me?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising. "Why are you doing this?" The man tilted his head slightly as if considering the question. Then he spoke, his voice low and raspy. "You've been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Marcus asked, his heart pounding. The man didn't answer. Instead he pointed ahead. Marcus followed his gaze and saw a narrow alleyway, barely wide enough for the cab to fit. He didn't want to go down there. He didn't want to see what was waiting for him. But he didn't have a choice. He turned into the alley, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The walls were lined with graffiti, the ground littered with trash. At the end of the alley was a door, old and rusted, with a faint light glowing beneath it. "Stop here," the man said. Marcus pulled up to the door and turned off the engine. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the keys. He didn't want to get out of the cab. He didn't want to see what was behind that door. But the man was already stepping out, his coat billowing around him like a shadow. Marcus hesitated, then followed. He didn't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't explain. The man pushed open the door and stepped inside. Marcus followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was small and dimly lit, the walls lined with shelves filled with strange objects, old books, jars of unidentifiable substances, and what looked like human bones. In the center of the room was a table, covered in candles and strange symbols drawn in what Marcus hoped was ink. The man turned to face him, his smile twisting into something even more grotesque. "You've been chosen," he said again. "To take my place." Marcus's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" The man stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. "I've been trapped here for too long. Bound to this place, to this curse. But you can set me free." Marcus shook his head, backing away. No, I don't want any part of this." The man's smile widened. "You don't have a choice." Before Marcus could react, the man lunged at him, his hands clawing at Marcus's face. Marcus stumbled back, knocking over one of the shelves. The jars shattered, their contents spilling across the floor. The man's grip tightened, his fingers digging into Marcus's skin. "You'll take my place," the man hissed. "You'll be the one they call for. The one they fear." Marcus struggled, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to fight this. But then he remembered the mirrors in the warehouse, the way they had shattered when the man touched them. Maybe that was the key. With all his strength, Marcus shoved the man away and grabbed one of the candles from the table. He threw it at the nearest shelf, the flame catching on the old books and spreading quickly. The man screamed, his face twisting in rage and fear. "No," he roared. "You can't do this." Marcus didn't stop. He grabbed another candle and threw it, the fire spreading faster now. The man lunged at him again, but Marcus dodged, his heart pounding. He didn't know if this would work, but it was the only chance he had. The room filled with smoke, the flames licking at the walls. The man screamed again, his body beginning to dissolve into shadow. Marcus turned and ran, bursting through the door and into the alley. He didn't look back. He just ran, his lungs burning, his legs aching. When he reached the cab, he threw himself inside and sped away, the firelight fading in the rearview mirror. He didn't stop until he was back in the city, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of the night. He pulled over and sat there, his hands shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The next night Marcus didn't go to work. He stayed home, the curtains drawn, the lights off. He didn't know if the man was gone for good. He didn't know if he'd really broken the curse. But he knew one thing: he couldn't go back to that life. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of the man in the coat began to fade. Marcus tried to move on, to forget what had happened. But sometimes late at night he would hear a voice in the back of his mind whispering his name. And sometimes when he looked in the mirror he thought he saw a shadow standing behind him.